Hey Marcus, so you cut your teeth with the racing out the Morning Advertiser, and then you had a job offer to join not only the Sport and Life but also the Daily Mail, and you joined the latter. And a lot of racing people might find that a bit strange. Why was the decision made to do that?
Well, the Morning Advertiser, the decision was made to drop racing, and we were all sort of given 6 months sort of notice that racing was going to finish and they were going to just concentrate on their core product. So I had 6 months to sort of put out feelers, and I did subbing shifts at the Sporting Life largely, and there was, I think, one of my co-subs at the time, freelance subs, was Peter Thomas, who's now one of the big writers at the Racing Post. So I sort of built up that sort of thinking that's what would possibly happen to me, becoming a freelance sub-editor, which a lot of people did in those days. And then I got a sort of a call from somebody at the Daily Mail at the same time. So I was in this very lucky position that I got 2 offers, and I just sort of logically thought that if I did well at the Sporting Life, I would maybe then the next move for me would be the Daily Mail or a national newspaper. So I just thought it was the best thing to do, the logical thing was to go straight to the national newspaper, really.
Okay, so you've turned up. You actually worked in the office at the Daily Mail, I assume.
Yes, yeah, I moved there 30 years ago, believe it or not. Yeah, they just opened up new offices in High Street, Kensington, Northcliffe House, and we were talking about technology earlier, about the lack of technology. I went from sort of from pencils and papers at the Morning Advertiser to this amazing sort of palace of an office that was built in central London, escalators, fountains. As I went in, I thought it was like going to a Disney set the first day I walked into it. But and new technology was there, and it was quite a gear change, even though we were dealing with the same sort of stuff, really. Yeah.
So what was your first role, and what would a day's work entail back then?
First role was I was what we called a racing sub-editor, which was. We had a mixture of roles. We used to sort of we used to sub race cards, which we also get the feed from all papers got the feed from the Press Association. So there was lots of data on the race cards, which you then had to tailor to your paper's requirements and styles. And that's that was just back in those days a relatively labour intensive thing, really. It was not particularly interesting, but it was had to be done. So you sub things out, you lay out pages, draw pages up, and sub copy, really. That was my basic role. And we back in those days, I'm trying to think. Somebody asked me the other day how many people worked on the Daily Mail racing desk. I think there were probably about 6 of us back then, plus freelancers. So we had a racing desk which was very well manned, and those sort of I don't think those I know that situation has changed considerably since then. We certainly don't have a racing desk anymore.
So fast forward quite a few years. You took over as a correspondent when Colin McKenzie retired.
Yeah, well, the first 20 years at the Mail, Colin McKenzie was racing correspondent, and I was sort of deputy racing editor and then editor while Colin was there, and Colin was fantastic. Colin was somebody who I admired him. He was very, very tenacious, and he far more than me actually. He had a real sort of nose for a story, and once he sort of got a sniff of something, he pursued it as far as usually to a successful conclusion. But he had a real journalistic instinct. He'd come from a bit of a completely different background to me. He'd actually worked on the Nigel Dempster sort of diary page at one stage, so he was sort of he was quite a sort of hard sort of nose journalism. That there was sort of chasing sort of errant husbands and errant wives sort of stories that he was used to sort of doing all that. But he was a great guy to work for, and I always think my one memory of working with Colin is that whatever you asked him to do, even though sometimes it was difficult and was, he might say that's a bit of a strange thing to ask. He always did it, and he always, he never argued and said I'm not doing. He never said I'm not doing that. He always did it, which was and he was a great, was a great example to me, definitely.
And did you learn a lot from him? Was he a good mentor? Did he sort of help you along when you were quite young?
Yeah, no, he was great. Colin was very generous. Yeah. There was he's helped. In just practical terms. If you asked him, you got a telephone number, this, do that. He never said no. He never said no. I imagine he was probably, when you're working with colleagues, especially in a sort of creative sort of situation, you ask, whether it's journalism or acting, whatever, I suppose you're always looking over your shoulder at the next sort of generation coming up, aren't you? But Colin never sort of hampered my progress in any way. He was just a great help, and as I say, he was a great example. Just his work ethic and his attitude to the job, really. Now,
fast forwarding again, you're now one of the senior figures in the press room. I think it'd be safe to say.
Oh dear.
How much has it changed since you came in there?
It's changed considerably. Largely sort of technology has played such a massive difference. We touched on earlier about how there was no computer. When I first went in, people didn't have laptops or whatever. People were writing longhand and filing by the telephone. So you have just having laptops and the internet just makes such a difference. If you think that if you need a fact these days, you just type it into a search engine, don't you? And you can find any statistic, any form figure you need is just a few seconds away. Back in those days, you had the form book, and you had physical publications, but lots of other stuff. People kept their own records. I remember going into the press room and people were going through yesterday's results, updating their personal figures, from how many winners a jockey had yesterday, so they knew, what the numbers were. So the access to information is massively different, but also the situation is a lot different. Because of the way sort of social media operates, and and just the wider media, there was a lot more exclusive stories back in those days. There was lots more things that were personal to particular journalists. Now, you very rarely see, say, a story in a newspaper where maybe the Gold Cup favourite is injured or out of it as an exclusive story, because those stories don't hold anymore. So they have to be revealed immediately, both ethically in terms of betting, but also because you just couldn't sit on a story like that anymore. So the whole dynamic has changed, and in terms of the way the reporting goes on and the way it's done.
Right, so thinking about it in that way, the newspapers held quite a bit of power when it came to the betting public and stuff.
Yeah, well, I think that there has been a massive change in power, and I think that we've had recent debates about news and how it's released, and back in those days, all the newspapers operate how largely bookmakers probably do now. We newspapers employed the columnists, the top jockeys had a column, the top trainers, maybe if they had a column, it was in the newspapers. So, and news came out via them. There are a few newspapers now who pay reasonable amount of money to employ leading racing figures, but most of them that is now being transferred to bookmakers and bookmakers' websites, and I'd say that's a debate which we've been having recently, which obviously a lot of people, there are issues with that we've had in the sport recently.
Okay, we're talking about bookmakers and betting. Part of your job is to try and relieve the bookmakers of their money, care of your tips to your readers. How much pressure is there for you when you're tipping stuff up in the paper?
Well, fortunately for me, I don't feel a lot of pressure in terms of tipping, unless I'm on a really terrible run. But Sam Turner, who I know you've interviewed recently, is Robin Goodfellow, so he is the main tipster. So the focus is on Sam really as our number one tipster. I just sort of tip around the edges a little bit. So it's obviously important for me to do as well as I can, but my job doesn't depend on it in that sense. But extending your sort of question, Simon, I think that tipping and the production of winners is still a very, very important part of media, certainly newspaper coverage. I think no matter what, I'm obviously trying to pursue stories and reporting, but the feedback that I have seen over 30 years working for the Daily Mail about, is that winners is what you get, or lack of them, if is what you get a feedback from the readers on. I remember days when it was often regular correspondence, because you recognised their handwriting, would write into you and they'd have a page of the Daily Mail cut out with red marks marking losers and a comment on it about what we should be doing and where we should be going. So winners are very important in certainly in national newspapers for the racing coverage.
So how important is your own personal betting in your life?
Fortunately, not that important really. I don't make money really. I just sort of and I don't bet a hell of a lot really. I have a bet, and I'm sort of last few years I've probably sort of been relatively neutral, but I only bet on big races really. I think the proliferation of racing and the number of race cards you have now, I think any punter and any tipster probably, it's best to specialise in many ways. And I say, fortunately, I can delegate to Sam, and I know that he has a system, and without a system, I think you're going to lose. Any punter would lose.
Okay, that's music to the ears of the bookmakers.
Yeah.
So how do you fear that the traditional role of a racing reporter is endangered, because a lot of people have lost their jobs already? The media's moved on with social media and instant gratification with Twitter, that sort of thing. Do you feel there is a future as a newspaper reporter?
I think that we're certainly on the endangered list. Not every newspaper now, not every national newspaper now has a racing correspondent, and I think that the problem with that is that other newspapers, tend to be to look across the landscape and question maybe potentially why they do if the opposition doesn't have. So I think there's a sort of a perpetuating sort of situation here, which that racing is definitely more under pressure than it's ever been, and that's partly commercial as well. That the operations concentrate on what they see as their biggest sellers, and they're tighter as well. You don't get any free space like used to happen. When I first, so I sound very old here, when I first joined the Mail, but 30 years ago, you could go to, in a national newspaper, you could get a racing report from a relatively small meeting, whether it be a Fontwell, a Plumpton, a Huntingdon. You could go there and just report on the day's racing. That doesn't happen anymore now, or very, very rarely. It is really what I would call harder news stories away from the big meetings. So the coverage has certainly sort of got smaller, and the fewer words you get in the paper, that inevitably leads to people maybe worrying about the long-term future of a racing correspondent in an organisation like a national newspaper.